My name is Tom, and I am going to use this presentation as a way to go over some of the mistakes that I made while developing my game Wobbledogs. This is going to be more from a high-level perspective than anything too nitty-gritty. I feel like when you have a game that was successful, there we go. Sorry, things are blocking notes. I feel like that when you have a game that's successful, it's very tempting to look back at it and use hindsight to try to figure out why it all went so well. But in this case, I feel like even though everything kind of worked out for me, it would be pretty useful to talk about what specifically did not. So first of all, who am I? Well, I started making games in high school with Java and Flash. And after that, I went to college at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where I dual majored in computer science and games and simulation arts and sciences, which is basically a game design major. I made and sold a few Flash games back when that was still a thing. And then I interned at EA for 2 semesters, first at Playfish, which is a now defunct studio that made Facebook games. And then secondly, on the Sims team, working on The Sims 4. Towards the end of my time in college, I worked on a game called Zenith with some pretty close friends, which actually won the student IGF back in 2012. And after that, I graduated and worked on the Sims team, where I'd interned on The Sims 4, and I helped ship that game, and I was there as a gameplay engineer for about 3.5 years. After that, I saved up a bit of money and quit to go indie. And since then, I've made a game called Animal Inspector, which is kind of like a Papers, Please, where you judge pets. I worked on a game called Tattletale, which is a Furby-based horror game. And then there's my current project, Wobbledogs, which I've been working on for the bulk of this time. If anyone here is not familiar with Wobbledogs, let me just play the trailer really quick to help give you a bit of a better idea of what it is. So I realize that might have prompted more questions, but hopefully it gave you some context at least. High level, Wobbledogs is a pet simulation game where you raise these goofy little physics dogs that mutate physically and aesthetically as you play, depending on what they eat. It's very loosely just kind of a guided sandbox where the main goal is basically just to play with these things, build them a home, get them to mutate, change their bodies however you'd like. And the game is currently out on Steam Early Access. So let's talk about young Tom for a second. 3 words come to mind when I think of this guy. Confident, invincible, naive. To even decide to make a project like this, these qualities, at least to some extent, I feel like are kind of necessary. I really didn't know what I was getting myself into, though I thought I did. If I knew, and I mean really, really knew and understood, I probably would not have tried to forge ahead with this specific project. To be frank, making this game has been by far the hardest thing that I've done in my entire life, and I mean that quite seriously. I'm glad I did it, but I would not do a project of this scope again, at least not as a largely solo venture. And to be clear, I did work with other people on art and audio, but not until much closer to the tail end of the project. There's a lot to be said for working with other people who have the same stake as you the entire time in what you're building. This game would not have turned out as good as it did without the people that I worked with, but I spent years of development working completely alone. Honestly, the fact that this game got made at all and is both selling well and being well received scares me a little bit. Even though this game is so far looking like a success, I tasted failure on this project. And I've tried to keep conscious of that and make sure that I'm not taking the wrong lessons from the fact that it ultimately all worked out. There were numerous times where I saw failure looming. I could practically reach out and touch the future where this game did not get finished. where I ran out of money and after 6 years was left burnt out and having to reevaluate my career. This didn't happen. It so easily could have, and it does happen all the time. You hear about indie successes and you hear about the occasional dramatic failure, but way more games than that just disappear silently. I was very clued into other projects when I first started this game. There were so many other games that started development around the same time as Wobbledogs, give or take a year, and a lot of them were really, really cool. Some of them came out, and more of them did not. Every developer that I know who has made a big project like this remembers other games that felt like they were being developed in tandem with their own, but were never finished. Developers who gradually posted less and less frequently until one day you realize it's been a year with no updates, then two, then three. Sometimes these games do resurface years later to varying levels of success, but more often they just never do. The risks I took while making this game were calculated, but they were still risks. And even though things did work out for me, I made mistakes, and I would like to talk about some of those mistakes in more detail. So I think the easiest way for me to start talking about my mistakes is to literally just start at the very beginning and walk you through development a bit. January 22nd, 2016 to January 28th, 2021. Almost exactly 5 years. These were the start date of the project, like literally the first time that I created the project file and the day that it ultimately released on early access. And I could easily keep working on this game for even longer. It's got roughly 1 year to go in early access and maybe a bit more for localization and porting. Was all this time necessary? Well, yes and no. I think a lot of this time was not spent productively working towards the final game that you see today, and the missteps may seem obvious in retrospect, but these are really hard lessons to internalize. To some extent, I think most people actually can't internalize these things until they experience them firsthand, and I know that's how it was for me at least, and it's how it has been for other people that I've talked to as well. So will this help, or will this talk help you actually avoid any of these mistakes? I can't say, but I do hope that it'll at least help you recognize them a little bit more easily. Until the final year or year and a half or 2 years of development, I maintained a pretty meticulous devlog on the TigSource devlog forums. So until the final stretch where I just sort of made the game and accepted what it was I was making and didn't post as much, it's actually very easy to go back and see exactly what I did, when I did it, and what I was thinking as I did. So I probably would have forgotten about all of this, or not all of this, a lot of this otherwise, or at least mix up the order of things, because 5 years is a really long time, as it turns out. So yeah, we're just going to start kind of walking through the earlier chunks of the development timeline, I think. The project was named Four-Legged Dog because it was literally just a physics prototype when I started. I'd seen these procedural 2D walking GIFs online, and I wanted to make something kind of like that, but in 3D. So the original idea was just that I would make some rough-looking dog that could move procedurally with any number of supported legs, starting with 4 and then going up from there. So I posted these initial GIFs on Twitter. This was just from the first few hours of development, and I kind of got an immediate response from them. At this point in time, I did not have a lot of reach online, but despite that, it was kind of clear that this was something that gelled with people, and there was some sort of immediate appeal. I'd been showing prototype progress for a while before this on other games that I was trying to figure out if they would work or not, and the fact that this got a response kind of spurred me to keep going, and is a big part of the reason I even started working on it legitimately. I used this prototype as an excuse to explore things that I was interested in, both thematically and technically. So I did a lot of genetic algorithm stuff for balance and standing up. I played around with limb compensation for if legs got injured. I did a lot of work on locomotion. The more that I did, the more I realized that I wanted to turn these things into legitimate creatures. I decided that I was basically going to invent an animal and simulate it as deeply as I could. And I didn't know exactly what that was going to entail, but I knew that's kind of what I wanted to make. When you don't have a solid design, it's very easy to immerse yourself in tech and in detail. You can kind of spend an infinite amount of time on it. It's immediately rewarding. It's interesting to work on. It's fun to show off. Not to call anybody out, because this is a completely made up example, but if you've ever seen your favorite Twitter game dev showing off their dynamic plant growth system that they implemented to automate foliage placement for one single themed level in their suspiciously polished solo project, there's a very real possibility that they're actually running from their game's larger problems. I poured all my effort into these kinds of things. Prototyping and iterating on tech and systems is not inherently bad, but when you're working on a multi-year project that you're expecting to be able to support yourself with, you do need to be doing this sort of thing with a goal in mind. Without one, you kind of run the risk of spending a long time on things that will later have to get redone or thrown out entirely. And that's exactly what happened to me. I hoped that prototyping all this tech would reveal a game design to me rather than trying to prototype things to support a design that already existed. I didn't really know what I was making beyond, I guess there are all these dogs and you'll raise them and you'll train them. And spoilers, that's not really an actual game design. So 3 months in, without any real design, I started working on an entry flow. I didn't spend a ton of time on it, and my biggest issues actually had not started yet. But this is kind of the first obvious misstep, I think, so I wanted to explicitly call it out. My process for small games has generally been to just start making them. This historically has actually worked out very well for me, but there's two main issues here. First of all, this approach doesn't scale to large games. For a small project, it's relatively easy to rework aspects of the game whenever you need to without too much risk. For large games, you can't really just wing it, though. Redoing some aspect of the game could end up costing you months instead of just hours or days. Secondly, while, at least in my experience, this approach can work for content-based games, I was trying to make something systems-based. For a content-based game, it's much easier, again, at least in my experience, to kind of just build out vertical slices of your project in order and have that turn into something. For a systems-based game, a lot of times something doesn't actually work at all until you build up that entire base layer and then just kind of keep moving. And I was not taking that approach. So about 4 to 5 months in, despite a lot of fooling around, the game was actually starting to look remarkably similar to how it ended up today. I had a working construction mode with vacuum pipes. The dogs slept and they ate food. I had started working on genetic variation, both physical and visual, and I actually had a dog patterning system that is still in the game today, like largely unchanged. This is pretty much what I ended up shipping with, just with a bit more content. I even had a dog breeding prototype that was nearly one-to-one what is in the final game today. I look back at this point now and I kind of want to kick myself because I'd already figured out what the game was. I just didn't really know it. And the major issues with development started very soon after. So as a brief aside, I want to talk to you about UI really quickly. About 6 months in, I decided to build a custom UI system instead of just using Unity's. If you ever decide to do this, you'd better have an extremely good reason for it. And no, I don't like the one that my engine already uses is not a good reason. A good reason would be something like, workflow-wise, it would be incredibly impractical to build all the UI that my game needs using the existing system. Or the existing system won't allow me to do these very specific, incredibly critical things that the game needs in order to function. As of today, I have ripped out almost every single piece of UI that uses this system, and there were quite a lot of them. All the stragglers will also have to get replaced at some point as I move towards supporting multiple resolutions, which the game does currently not. If you take one thing from this talk, I actually hope it's this. Never, ever, ever build polished UI before you know what your game is. I'd actually say never build polished UI before you're 100% sure that it's functional and you've tested an ugly version of it in full context. There is a near 100% chance that you will have to rebuild this stuff later on down the line, and please don't do that to yourself. So back to the game though. About this time, I started to get very antsy about not feeling like I had a solid gameplay loop. So inspired partly by the Chow races actually in Sonic Adventure Battle 2, I started prototyping some dog racing stuff. And this idea by itself isn't bad. I'm still relatively early in the project since it's meant to be a multi-year thing, and prototyping an external game mode at this point, I think is totally okay. What's not okay is how I went about it. After some initial racing prototyping, I dove straight into designing world context and building out a full, at least somewhat polished UI flow with completely fleshed out internal systems to support this flow. I built out a travel system. I built out a basic navigation system and a conversation system with animated text boxes, which, by the way, is one of the all-time classic tells that a developer is running from their problems. An automated promotional flyer event system to introduce races, like all this stuff before even being confident that the racing system was any good. or that even if it was any good, it would make the rest of the game good. It's very, very easy to look at all this stuff in retrospect and say that it was a bad idea, but I don't think that's really the best, most productive way to look at it. So I want to talk a little bit about why I made this mistake. I wasn't confident that the game would be fun as just a pet simulation. I felt that I needed to justify that with other mechanics. Because of that, I was not really that willing to give up on this prototype when it didn't immediately click. I felt very pressured to make it work. The prototype did not feel scalable though, because, or especially because it was bound by the mechanics and systems of all these physically simulated dogs. And it felt like a superficial diversion more than anything embedded in the gameplay. And it kind of was. Instead of scrapping it or trying to design a solution, I just procrastinated. How did I do that? By building out context and polish. I hoped that by adding all this stuff on top of what didn't work, all my problems would just kind of get wallpapered over and wouldn't end up mattering that much. Much like these dogs, I was kind of stuck on a treadmill. Towards the tail end of the racing prototype days, by the way, when it was starting to become clear that it wasn't really going to work out, I procrastinated even further by experimenting with custom fur shaders. I'm not really sure that anything else needs to be said about that. Yeah, so 9 months in, I finally sat down and I made a schedule. I realized that if I was going to continue doing the racing stuff, I needed to at least make sure that it was going to be possible to finish it. So I sat down and I scheduled everything out, and guess how long it looked like it was going to take? 6 years. Now, if you've ever tried to estimate a project's timeline before, you can probably see that while this estimate is scary, the actual timeline for this project would likely be even more terrifying. If I estimated the game at 6 years, it was almost certainly going to take even longer than that. It's notoriously hard to accurately estimate things like this, especially so early on. So I got to work, and I managed to scope this down to 3.5 years by making some cuts to my vision. But this is with a big condition. This was only the scope in the case that all my designs and mechanics actually worked. There was no iteration time here. This was just the game making it, and the prototype was not convincing. So I sat down and I thought about it, and I wrote these words in my devlog at the time. I don't want this game to be just a goofy dog simulator. I do want that to be a large part of the experience, but it's very important to me that I give at least some amount of goals and context to what you're doing. That doesn't necessarily mean story, but I want to give people something beyond just a dog sandbox. Then I took a few days to think further and try to come up with ideas of how to implement that with this design, and then I came back with this. Done a lot of thinking, and I've decided that the best thing for the game is going to be for me to double down on the pin gameplay and cut out everything else. Rather than building up multiple disconnected systems and trying to come up with designs to tie them together afterwards, I'm going to try and keep everything restrained to the dog pins and focus on building a tight loop with lots of content. And yeah, wow, yes, no, this is great. This is actually what I ended up shipping. 9 months in of a 5-year development cycle, it seems like I have it figured out, so good job me. And I stuck to this for a while. I added eggs, and I added puppies, and I experimented more with pipes. I added a liquid spreading system so the dogs could get slippery. I gave them new heads. I started to play around with more extreme bodies. I added some skin folding graphical tech, which actually isn't in the final game because the shader doesn't support it. But it was an interesting thing to play with. And I tried around with, I made steam rooms for incubating eggs. I prototyped a queen system for controlling which dogs would lay eggs. I got dogs to actually grab onto objects directly. I made their faces squishy and so much more. There was a roughly 6th to 7th month period of doing this stuff here. And looking back on it, I think this was actually one of the golden ages of development on this project for me. So much of this stuff is still in today, at least in some form. There's also a lot of stuff that didn't work out, but the difference is that this was prototyping and systems building with a specific goal. I was fleshing out and giving personality to a pet simulation game. I still didn't have the most defined loop, but as long as the game was going to be about hanging out with these dogs, these were all relevant things to be working on. However, all good things must come to an end. Doubts started creeping back in, and I once again lost confidence in my direction. I started to refocus my prototyping on new external game modes and systems. I tried to make an adventure system where you could give your dogs commands directly and get them to accomplish tasks in the wild. I tried to come up with a dynamic trick system that could be controlled by drawing on-screen lines. I also spent a week or so making a dog battle arena, but no evidence of that particular journey has survived, and suffice it to say, it was not actually that interesting. uh, None of this stuff worked out though. So I did at least make the correct decision at this point to drop these prototypes rather than continuing to hammer on them, but I was left with a few realizations. One, watching something struggle is cute, but being in control of that struggle is not. And two, the less deterministic your simulation, the harder it is to apply traditional game mechanics to it. For example, it's hard to build an upgrade system around increasing move speed when the best working version of your movement simulation is already fairly unpredictable, hence the main problems with the races. I'd also like to read you these few paragraphs that I wrote up in the devlog right after this. Right now, my idea is to build the game based off of what already works. The game as it currently stands has no goal, but is fun to look at and fun to experiment with. I can honestly say that even now, after over a year of active development, I still find it entertaining to jump into the pen and watch the dogs go about their business. There's not a ton to actively do, but it's fun to direct the simulation a bit. So rather than try and inject additional modes of control into the game or external features, I'm considering making it just more about experimentation and discovery, drip feeding new objects, mutations, and bits of story to the player as a reward for exploration. I think this is interesting because we've heard this before, right? Like, isn't this what I just said nearly word for word in an earlier devlog just a few slides ago? I also wrote a bit about how genetics might fit into the overall experience. First of all, I'd like to give more direct control over genetics. Breeding through multiple generations is fun, so there's no reason to gate it as much as I am currently. Maybe eggs once laid or resources that you use to hatch instantly whenever you choose. Maybe you can assign whichever parents you want and preview the results. Maybe you can modify a dog's genetics in real time with injections. Maybe you unlock modifiers for manual use after discovering them. Second, I'm finding that genetic modifiers could be the point of the game itself. Inbreed a dog to the point that it loses its eyes. Feed a dog specific fruit to cause it to sprout vines. Put a dog in an anti-grav room for long enough that its legs get super weak and spindly from lack of use, etc., etc. Maybe specific combinations could result in handmade specialty dogs. This is literally what the game is now. Those features are not all in one-to-one, but this is effectively the pitch. Again, I kind of know what the game is, or it seems like I do when I write about it. So I stuck to my guns for about 2 more months before this wisdom once again got thrown out. I was stuck on the idea that the game had to have an economy, and I could not shake that. Whenever you need money in a game, however, you also need a reliable way to get it, and turns out that does not mesh very well with sitting back and relaxing, and it generally requires more active player input. So this was kind of still all at odds with the non-deterministic dog behavior and movement systems that I'd spent a ton of time building and was not willing to compromise on. So I prototyped some strangely nebulous thing where you as the player would be live streaming your dogs as an in-game Twitch feed, and people would shower you with donations whenever the dogs did something that they liked. This didn't really go anywhere. It didn't ever have a solid design. It was more of an idea. Like the pitch I gave you is pretty much all the details that I had worked out. But the real thing that I want to mention here is that around the same time, I also publicly demoed the game for the first time. I made a custom build without any mechanics attached to it. All it was a little screen where you could customize your dogs and then drop them into the world and watch them do their thing. It went over really well. Like, people had fun just goofing around with the dogs. A bit later, this place in Australia called Bar SK, which is sadly not around any longer, showed this same build for a Year of the Dog event. It also went over really well, but I didn't believe it. I didn't have the confidence to let the dogs stand on their own. I tried to justify why people found this fun to myself and didn't think it would sustain a full play session for a commercial product. So this was kind of a vicious cycle. By now you've seen it repeat a few times, but let's put it into more direct language. So step 1 is to lack confidence in the game as a pet simulation. Step 2 is to prototype massive, largely disconnected systems to try and find magic. Step 3 is when the prototype doesn't work out and you can't figure out how to fix it, polish it and hope that that makes the difference. And then step 4 is to scrap the prototype after it's clear that no amount of polish is going to fix it, and then write a long post about how you finally realize your game is just a pet simulation and that's okay. And this is kind of the core of what I'm getting at with all this. Like, I don't have time to get in all the details, but at this point, and at this point, it feels redundant to even try, but I did this several more times before actually buckling down and finally making the game that I ended up with. This stuff is deceptively nefarious. I repeated this cycle over and over during this project, and I even explicitly recognized that I was doing it. I called it out and wrote about how I finally realized that the game just needed to go back to its basics. This is why I said at the beginning that these types of lessons are almost impossible to internalize unless you experience them yourself, because they're hard to internalize even when you do experience them yourself. I really encourage anyone who's interested to go back and read through the devlog. But if you'd like another taste of the extremes I got myself up to, at one point I went in deep into a prototype where you would raise dogs for showbiz and get them to participate in paid commercials and ads. And then later on, I started building what would essentially be a physically simulated Factorio clone on top of everything else, where you would create an egg production facility to make money. The merits of the first idea are debatable, though ultimately that prototype suffered from a scope issue more than anything else. But I feel like I shouldn't have to explain to anyone why this second idea might have been particularly bad. Making games is hard. This stuff is hard. The automated egg production facility prototype was thankfully the end of my fantastic journey to the middle of a swamp. After that, I started putting all the original mechanics back into the game. And unfortunately, yes, I did actually have to re-implement most major systems at that point. And the game finally started to turn into what it is today. My journey here is unfortunately not that unique, though. It may be more explicitly documented, and it may be a bit more extreme than usual, but most developers that I know who I've talked to who have made a big dream project like this, whether it got finished or not, had to make that game multiple times before they finally accepted it and understood what exactly it was. I can't speak to everyone else's experience with these type of things, but from my perspective, there's a few ways to explain this. First of all, if you're doing this type of massive dream project, you probably have something to prove. I did, at least. Making a game like this is not financially responsible. It might work out. It might even make you rich, but it's also wildly risky. And if it doesn't pan out, it can leave you in a very, very bad position. You only do this type of thing if you really, really, really want to. And when you're staking so much on a passion project, it's kind of hard not to get idealistic about it. That ideal is dangerous. You can't live up to it, or at least you can't count on living up to it, and you're going to have to make concessions. That said, if you've never attempted something like this that's this grand before, you probably don't actually believe that your game can't. Excuse me. You probably don't actually believe that the game can't exist in its ideal form. You might tell yourself that you realize this, and you might tell others that you realize this, but if you truly, truly believe that, would you really be making it to begin with? Would you really be signing up to spend 5 largely lonely years on this project? So could all this have been avoided? If I recognized the issues I was dealing with and I still fell into all the traps, what could I have done about it? I don't have all the answers here, but I have a few specific thoughts. Firstly, lean into the medium. Games are fake. They're made up. They're invented. They're all illusion. I spent a big chunk of development trying to make these dogs feel real. That's a noble goal, and ultimately one I still keep in mind while continuing to design things. But there's an important thing to note here, which is that there are different ways to accomplish this goal. I spent a long time trying to make these dogs feel real in the naturalistic sense. Like I spent literal months, maybe even over a year in total, just tweaking their physics. I'm happy with how it turned out, but I'm not convinced that I couldn't have just used their movement from one of the earlier prototypes and had it just been okay. I got obsessed with trying to make it seem like they moved realistically, and anytime I found a situation where they didn't, I reevaluated and dove back into iteration. At this point in time, the dogs do not move 100% naturally. They never will, and that's honestly okay. I cheat. It's a game. I use external forces all over the place, something I consciously tried to avoid early on, or at least tried to avoid the appearance of. There was no reason to give myself this limitation. The dogs did not need to feel alive by real world standards. They just needed to feel realistic by their universe's standards. The topic of physics programming, natural movement, best practices for these things, I could talk about that for another hour just on its own. But suffice it to say that the more complex the thing you're trying to simulate, the longer it's going to take to make it feel correct. It was completely worth spending a lot of time on getting these dogs to feel good. But after a certain point, there's diminishing returns with this stuff. And it's really important not to lose sight of the bigger picture. And to be fair, a big part of this issue was a direct result of me not having done any physics programming before this project. I was learning on the fly with no real mentorship, and I made a lot of mistakes early on that I ended up having to correct later. If I was tasked with redoing dog motion today, I'm sure it would ultimately go a ton faster and probably even look better. But I think this brings up another good point, which is when you're making something like this, there's a very good chance that you're in over your head, at least just in terms of scope. Like making a huge project is not something you're likely prepared for if you have not done it before. Even in my case, I'd worked on a massive project before. Like I worked on The Sims 4. There were hundreds of people. There were years of development. But that wasn't a game that I was in charge of. And that's a lot different. When you have such a huge hurdle to get over, you need to make sure that you also aren't creating too many other new hurdles simultaneously. You can only efficiently learn so much at once. I took this project as an opportunity to do a lot of things for the first time. This made everything go more slowly and made developing more inefficiently than was probably good. Be aware that anytime you're doing something majorly new for you, it's not going to go as smoothly as if it was something you already had experience with. So don't overload. It's okay to innovate in some areas and to some degree, like that's necessary, but there's going to be more projects in the future. You don't have to pour everything into this one project. And then testing. Testing is important, but let me qualify this because everyone knows you're supposed to test your games. Like that's not useful advice. So why am I mentioning it? Well, you need to think about testing range as well. As much as I loved working on this game, it's not the type of game that I personally play. It's also not the type of game that most of my game dev friends personally play. This means that when I tested it with myself or with friends, and when talking to other game developers to get advice on stuff, a lot of the time, I was only covering certain aspects of the experience. All this type of testing and feedback was amazing for practical stuff. Like it was super useful for when I had a specific defined problem and I wanted to figure out how to solve it. Stuff like trying to design a good pipe construction system, or testing a tutorial, or looking for the solution to something technical and specific. It was not, however, great for figuring out if my target audience was going to find this game fun. I distinctly remember one point on this project where I told a good friend and really talented developer that I'd spent a lot of time recently getting the dogs to directly grab onto and carry around objects. I remember him looking at me and asking why. Like, what problem was that solving? From one perspective, that's a really great question. I still wasn't confident in the game at this point, and he knew that. Was this feature trying to fix my core issues? Was it worth spending time on? That said, I think ultimately this was the wrong question to be asking. The real question here was actually, why aren't you just making the game that you're so clearly interested in making? From his perspective, the dogs picking up objects and carrying them around was not a real feature. It was not something that was going to sell him on the experience. It didn't try to solve my biggest problem. From the perspective of somebody who actually loved pet sims or life sims, however, this is a critical feature. The dogs obviously need to be able to do this. This is something that would be noticed if it wasn't implemented, and it is something that would be desired. Whenever I got people to test the game who were more inclined towards experiences like this, they enjoyed it. Like they had fun just playing around with it, even in its earlier states. I ignored this though, because my gut told me that there needed to be something more. And in some ways I was correct. There did need to be more content. There needed to be more surprises and decorations and behaviors. There needed to be a little bit of a loop that allowed you to see the dog's life cycles. These are simulation features that complement and extend the core stuff I've been working on since day one and that people were enjoying. I was so stuck on the idea that what the game actually needed was to just be a game. If I just talked with more people who played these types of things or done more explicit research into other experiences like this, I think I would have realized this a lot sooner. I made the mistake of not listening to my audience. So high level, I feel like at this point I've gone into a good amount of the specifics. So let's recap a little bit, like what really went wrong here. So first of all, process. Like I tried to make a big game with the same approach I used for making small games. I assumed I would just figure it out as I went. This is a risky way to make any game, but especially so once the game is of a certain scale. I was stuck in the prototype mindset for an abnormally long portion of development because of this. 2, confidence, specifically a lack of it. I know I said earlier that I was very confident in my abilities, especially as a younger developer, but that's not what I mean here. I spent a considerable amount of time working on this game without being confident in the game as a game. This led to procrastination development. And I mentioned this a few other times. And seriously, like once you recognize the signs of this, you will see it everywhere. I constantly attempted to add new gameplay systems and structures instead of just tackling the major issues. 3, public development. I made this game in public a lot of the times. I showed my progress regularly in multiple places and got a lot of attention for it. And let me be clear, this isn't strictly a negative thing. I can tell you right now that Wobbledogs almost certainly would not exist if I had not been making it publicly. There were multiple points during development where I came incredibly close to scrapping the project. But the support and enthusiasm I got from people watching me make it and getting excited about it led me to kind of keep pushing forward. In addition to that, public development meant that there was a built-in audience upon release. I was essentially doing marketing and development in tandem. And so this made things a bit less risky financially, at least assuming that I actually finished the game and that it was any good. That said, public development has downsides as well. And some of these are just dependent on the developer as a person. Me personally, I felt incredibly responsible to the people who got excited about the project. And I was extremely aware of the potential to disappoint them. There is a massive difference between someone enjoying a funny GIF and somebody actually enjoying the entire game that GIF is from. My entire time making this game, I was very, very aware of that. I've witnessed it firsthand with several other games, and I did not want that to be the case with Wobbledogs. So beyond just trying to make a good game, a big part of the way I handled this was to try and make a game that would appeal to as many people as possible. And I'm going to tell you right now that that's not realistic. Like you can't appeal to everybody because then you're not targeting anyone. I lived for the praise, but I was incredibly controlled by the worry of disappointing anyone. And again, in addition to that, like public development kind of exacerbated all the other problems. It acted as a sort of feedback loop when combined with my loose process and lack of confidence. Procrastination development tasks are notoriously great things to show off. And this is true almost by definition, because they're usually self-contained features that sound cool, but don't require a single lick of context. And it's incredibly easy to get addicted to building things like that when you're avoiding larger issues. But it's even easier when you know that you can also get immediate praise online by doing so. It's a very dangerous combination. But I don't mean for this talk to be a downer. Like, seriously, I don't. The process I went through while making this game taught me more about development than I could possibly convey during the timeline that I have right now. Technically, design-wise, philosophically, like honestly, it was an invaluable experience that I quite literally will carry with me through the rest of my career. And I feel more capable as a developer than I ever did before. It was not efficient, but in the end, I did prove to myself that what the game ended up being is what it really wanted to be. I really do believe in my game now. And at this point, I have an extremely robust idea of what works, what doesn't, and why that is. It's far from perfect, but I understand what it is. Like I'm satisfied with it as an experience. And could I have gotten there more quickly? Yeah, definitely. Would I be as completely satisfied about where it ended up, though? I'm not sure. I'd probably have more regrets. There's maybe a lesson in there about romanticizing what could have been. In addition to all that, all this procrastination prototyping did actually contribute to the game. Not all of it was useful, and it definitely could have been more targeted. But if you read through the devlog, you'll see that a surprising amount of things that seem useless or random did actually make it into the final game in some form or another. And I'm not praising this process, but the game also wouldn't quite be the same without it. And then I also need to make sure it's obvious that this talk is specifically about mistakes. I also think there is a lot that I did right, and I'm incredibly proud of where the game ended up. And during its time in early access, I really think it's only going to continue to get better. I know I've already said this earlier, but seriously, making games is very hard. It sometimes feels like a miracle that anything ever gets made at all. But while it's important to celebrate and recognize the things that went right, I think it's also equally as important to dive into and to reflect on the things that did not. And that's the talk.
Yay! Thank you, Tom.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting, and that actually helped me as a game developer too, because I have actually, when developing a game, I would run around from some problems I didn't know how to fix, and just kept adding new features like, hey, I did this. This is so cool. But, driving away from the actual main point of the game, if that makes sense. So that helped me so much. That was such a good presentation, Tom. I learned so much from it.
No, thank you.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Just hear how you gave up so many times, and you were like, "Is this really what I want to make?" But that's why you always gotta have faith and believe in your ideas, because there are people that do want to see something. I guess what I'm trying to say is I've been there before when I made my own smaller game, just why am I making this? Who's really gonna enjoy it? But then when you really think about it, as long as you think it's fun, then everyone else will probably think it's fun too, and that's what kept me going personally. So
yeah, it's important.
Can't
lose sight of it.
But I actually had a question. So you were saying you made this game in Unreal. Do you have any experience with other engines? Oh no, not Unreal. You were making Unity, but have you used other engines like Unreal before? Why Unity over the other ones? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, sure. So I actually have never used Unreal before. The main reason for using Unity is because I was already fairly familiar with it. So especially when starting a large project, I mentioned kind of earlier, you shouldn't overload on learning too many things at once. And this is one decision that I do think was actually good, in that I stuck with something that I was already comfortable with. So there was no learning process for the engine specifically. I knew how to accomplish the major things that I wanted to with it. In the future, I'm definitely interested in exploring new tech and new engines, though. I don't want to necessarily stick to Unity forever just for the sake of it. But, that's kind of an in-between project thing, at least from my perspective.
So where I'm sorry, can I ask one more question?
Okay, you can ask one more question.
All right. So it's did you learn Unity in college? Because when I actually went to Santa Monica College, that's why I'm a part of this today, and we were using Game Maker instead, which I've used before in middle school, but it's I found it a lot harder to find a place to learn Unity or Unreal, something like that. It's how did you start to when did you start to learn that, and where, basically?
Unity specifically?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, they taught, I guess it was junior year in college, they had us start to use Unity for some projects. And there wasn't great teaching for it specifically. It was more just use this engine and make something with it. But then friends and I, started using it for our own projects outside of school related stuff. And I mentioned that I worked on that game Zenith, and that was our senior year project for an experimental game design class. We could use whatever we wanted for that, but we used Unity for that too. And that's actually where I learned most of the basics for that engine, just because we were building up a full decent sized game with it. Nice. So it was a lot of kind of personal, just kind of a personally driven experimentation, I guess.
I see. Thanks.
Nice. Okay. I should have said this. If you have any questions, please type in the chat or use reactions. And let's see, how do I do it? It's there's a way to raise your hand in Zoom. Let me just figure out how to do that. Actually, darn. I'm trying to figure out how to raise hands.
I It's okay. It should be like underneath all the other emojis. There's like a raise hand, lower hand.
I know I see clap, thumbs up, heart, joy, open mouth, ta-da.
It might be that you don't have the most recent version of Zoom. So if you haven't,
Oh darn. Okay.
your reactions won't have
Okay.
raise hand.
So I'll just say if you can't see the raise hands, react with a thumbs up as well. I'll see that. And you want to ask a question. So I'm going to start with Dave. Dave has a question. While in school, what ways would you have changed yourself to be ready for larger projects like Wobbledogs?
That's a tough one, actually. So the thing that like hits me the most when I think about like how I could have prepared for stuff like this is like the time that I spent working on Wobbledogs was longer than the time I spent in college, which is wild to think about.
Whoa.
But it's true, you know. I went to a 4-year school. And the bulk of the time in school was not spent directly working on games, even though that was part of the major that I had. There's a lot of other classes and you're doing other things as well. So, man, it's tough because I think, and this is probably the responsible thing, most colleges that focus on game design or game development are probably trying to prepare you for working in like a team environment, not necessarily preparing you to be a solo developer. And I think that makes sense because from some perspective, it would be kind of irresponsible for a school to train you to be an indie and then send you off into the world. Like that's not a great career decision at that point in time. So it makes sense for them to be teaching you like about collaboration. And if you're like on a producer track, then you learn about project management stuff. And if you're not, then you learn about your specific discipline and how to work with a bigger team and stuff. But like one thing that I learned from my time doing internships and from working in the industry is that so much of that is going to be different team to team and is very, very hard to like legitimately learn and internalize until you have that hands-on experience. And I think to some degree, working on a large solo project like this is kind of similar. I think, you know, like if a school had you take an entire semester to make a game yourself and that was a full class, that's like an experience that will help teach you about scoping and managing projects like this alone. And that's very valuable. But there's a huge difference between working on a game for a semester and working on a game for 5 years. And there's a huge difference between working on a game for a class and between working on a game that you are relying on to support you financially. And so to some degree, you're always going to kind of be jumping off the deep end when you do something like this. And I unfortunately don't really know that there's a great way around that other than maybe just like very, very intentionally working up to it. But that's not a situation that most people are in, I think, when starting something like this. So yeah, it's tough. I think schools can kind of only do so much in that regard. There's always going to be some amount of just kind of going for it. But, you know, trying to be conscious of the process and like listening, like hearing about other stories and having made games before, like all that stuff does help.
Okay, Armel has a question for you. Is there a brainstorming and ideation process or a project management tool you settled on because of this experience that you expected that will help you stay focused on the important stuff without sacrificing the possibility for
You're good.
serendipitous design opportunities?
So basically the question is there like a management process or tool that could help make this stuff a little bit easier going forward, doing this type of thing again, right? That's kind of what I believe it's getting at. So first thing that I'll call out is I use Trello, Trello, pretty religiously for keeping track of tasks and stuff. For small projects, it's less of a big deal, but for something like 5 years big, you need something to track what you are what your tasks are, what bugs you have to fix. It doesn't have to be anything complicated, but you need some way to have that stuff all in front of you, because you are 100% not going to remember it after, it's been 3 years. So you need some sort of management tool. It doesn't matter too much how in-depth it is. That's kind of just to your preference, I think, but you need something. But the bigger lesson, honestly, for me, after having I took a few breaks during development of Wobbledogs to work on some smaller things with a friend. That's when Tattletale came out. Is going forward, trying to develop a large game again. I think it's honestly a huge advantage to be working with somebody else from the beginning. I mentioned this very briefly, like somebody else who has the same stake in you as you in the project you're working on, and like understands it as deeply as you, it's hard to overstate like how big of an advantage that is, because you can bounce ideas off each other. Making jokes with a friend about your project is honestly a great way to come up with features. And I mean that very seriously. But it also is a great way to keep you honest, because you have somebody to call you out. They understand what the game is as well. They understand just as well as you do how long it's going to take and how hard certain things are going to be. And it's easy to get lost in the weeds when you're just alone, and there's no one to really pull you back. But if you're working with somebody else, it's much easier to kind of keep playing that bits of tug of war on the project and just kind of keep yourself on track. And to some extent, I did this a little bit on Wobbledogs. I had a very close friend that I was not working with on the game, but he was Ben Esposito, who made Donut County. We went to college together, and he was working on his game, which was also like a 5-6 year project. There was some overlap when we were both working on our big projects at the same time. And so we would chat about it a lot and explain our problems to each other. And it's very different than if we were actually working together, but there was some degree there of that dynamic. And, I still made all these mistakes, but it helped recenter things a bit more than I think I would have been able to do alone. So I really recommend that. Like I mentioned earlier, making a solo project like this, a lot of times you have something to prove, even if it's just to yourself. But there's no shame in working with other people. And I definitely plan to do that more going forward.
Okay, Maxwell has a question for you. What is your favorite game?
That's a tough question. I never know how to answer this because I can't point out like a very specific game, I think, that's my favorite. But there's a few things that come to mind when I think about inspirations and stuff. So first of all, the game that kind of started getting me really interested in more experimental indie stuff. I'd been aware of it before, but this, for whatever reason, kind of flipped a switch in my head. It was a game called Space Funeral, which is made by a developer called The Catamites, who his stuff is like amazing. You should look it up if you haven't heard of it, but it's this very surreal like RPG Maker RPG. And it's kind of a joke game, but also very well done. And it's very hard to describe. You just kind of have to look it up, but it's very surreal and strange and kind of beautiful. And it opened my eyes a bit to like the potential for stuff like this. And it made me want to make something very similar, which is always kind of high praise, I feel like, when you play something and you want to make that game. It made me wish that I had made it. So there's that. From more of just like a relaxation, chill out perspective, I'm obsessed with the Picross games. I really, really like those. They're just kind of these puzzle games where you plunk down squares to make a picture based off of like what numbers are in the corner. And those are like among my favorite, just kind of like zone out and relax type games. Really enjoy those. And then just from like another perspective, like I've played a ton of Super Smash Brothers. Super into that game. I've been playing it since launch. It's great to have something to kind of continuously come back to and feel like you can put skill into and feel yourself getting better at something that's not specifically your job. There's something kind of freeing about that. But I mean, I could go on about things that I enjoy for a very long time, but those are some of the initial three that come to mind.
Oh yeah, by the way, Tom, my brother is also really big on Picross. That's one of his favorite things too. So
yeah, good. I appreciate that. Yeah, those games are awesome.
Okay, this will be the final question. for today. You said that. Sorry, you said this is. I'm a huge fan of Zenith, by the way. Oh yeah, I let Tom know about that part too. Actually, do you have a question about Zenith's development? Because Bartu, you actually no, I should stick to. Armel said I just now asked a question before, so I'll say that question. You said that. Sorry, you said this isn't a game you would typically play. Is that unusual? Did that happen because of your experience with The Sims?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think this is kind of different for everybody, or at least I don't want to speak for every other person who makes games. But from my perspective, the types of games that I like to play and the types of games that I like to think about and find interesting, just like from a development standpoint, are very different. I really, really enjoy these types of simulations from a development standpoint. I think they're fascinating. Well, I mentioned earlier that I didn't do enough research into old games, and that's true, but I did still spend a little bit of time looking into like the Pet series and the Creatures series, and it's fascinating. Like, I find that stuff so interesting, and I listened to like a talk or two about the design for some of those, and I chatted briefly with the guy who made Creatures, and I think that stuff is really, really cool. That said, it's not. I don't have fun playing those types of games, at least this point in my life. So there's some sort of disconnect there, and I don't know exactly what it is. And likewise, there's a lot of games that I find really fun to play. Like I just mentioned, Picross. I have zero desire to make a Picross game. That sounds completely uninteresting to me. I don't want to do it. I don't think the challenges there are things that I personally would get invested in. And I don't know why exactly that is. I've talked to other people who do feel kind of similarly. I don't think I'm completely alone in that, but at least for me, that's pretty common when I start thinking about things. But as far as influence from The Sims, I think that's kind of hard to avoid. Like The Sims was 3.5, 4 years of my life. And it was my first professional, or like, well, not first, because I did a Playfish internship before that, but nearly my first professional experience, among my first professional experience with games. And I learned a ton while I was there, and I worked with people who were way more talented than me in multiple different mediums, and a lot of that stuff rubs off on you. And so I obviously thought a lot about the design of that game while I was working on it. So yeah, there was absolutely influence there. And I know that like my entire time there was lots of subconscious thoughts of like, how would I make a game like this that would be more geared towards the stuff that I find interesting? And I didn't come up with Wobbledogs while I was working there, but I think it did rub off on me. And one thing that I actually think is pretty interesting, I didn't touch on this while I was talking, but over the course of designing things for Wobbledogs and coming up with features, I realized a lot of, I kind of like rediscovered a lot of the reasons why The Sims is built the way that it is, because I did things the wrong way, and then realized like, oh, this thing that they do on The Sims that I didn't really fully understand why they do it, this is why they do it, because it's solving this incredibly specific problem. And you know, having that experience with the game kind of gives you a language to start solving these problems, and I think they do kind of naturally creep into your design when you spent so much time thinking about them and working with them.
Okay, this is the true last question now. Bartu wants to know what drove the team behind Zenith to make the moon mission super hard.
Yeah, so this was a long time ago, and I was not the main designer on that game. So I don't necessarily want to speak to fact here, but as far as I remember it, like we built all the missions, most of the early missions for the game, and then kind of just reached a point where we were like, you know, the main thing that's fun in this game, Zenith, by the way, for people who aren't familiar, is like a game where you play a guy in a mech suit in the middle of a desert with these like massive looming structures, and you pretty much it's framed as like you have a cell phone and you get a message that's told you to deliver zines to people. That's like the core conceit, but you kind of just like skate around, and it's all about movement and using speed and momentum to get to these like hard to reach places. And the real fun of the game is getting to those hard to reach places and kind of free form discovering where you can go and how you can get to places that seem impossible. And so early on, we made some early missions to get people to go to certain places and to start to see how to interact with things and understand how to interface with the world. But then it felt like it wasn't there. There was a certain point where that wasn't interesting anymore, and we just kind of needed to give people freedom. And so giving the ultimate goal of get to the moon as the final mission and there's no direction was kind of, looking back on it, I think exactly the right thing for that game, because it meant that you were no longer listening to instructions. You weren't supposed to just like go to the next signpost. You had this impossible task, and the only way you're going to accomplish it is by playing and experimenting and discovering on your own how all the mechanics fit together. And if you explore the world to its fullest, you'll probably figure it out eventually. And it's a pretty cool feeling, I think, when you do. So that was, again, from what I remember, kind of the driving idea behind it.
Amazing. Okay.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming and talking, Tom.
Yeah,
That
thanks for
was
having me.
Amazing.
I
I
really
really
appreciate
liked the
it.
presentation, and I learned so much from it.
I
Yeah, I'm
also
glad.
loved it. It was very inspiring for
I'm
me
glad.
as well. So